new Necro, Birthing Pod sorta returns, and another Soul Land in Modern. Let's talk some Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So we've reached the end of week 1 of spoiler season, and we have some ridiculous cards to talk about today. Callbacks to Necro and Birthing Pod, a Soul Land reprint into Modern. It is wild stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Modern cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Modern Horizons 3. So we kick things off today with a reprint, but it is a good one, likely one of the most impactful cards for Modern from the entire set in Phyrexian Tower. So if you don't know Phyrexian Tower, it's a legendary land. It taps to make a colorless, or you can tap it and sack a creature to make double black mana. So this is a card that, just reprint-wise, really solid. It's like a $40 card, so even if it doesn't see Modern play, and it will see Modern play, and probably a lot of it, it's still a card you're going to be super happy to open in your pack. And this is a land that can make 2 mana. And we talked earlier in the spoiler season when Ugin's Labyrinth was revealed about how lands that make multiple mana pretty much always really good to downright broken in Magic. Think Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, Eye of Ugin, Eldrazi Temple. Phyrexian Tower is another one of these lands. Yes, there is a hoop you need to jump through. You need a sacrificeable creature, but that's not a big deal for a lot of decks. And the reward of having a land that makes 2 mana makes it more than worth sacrificing your own stuff. So we recently got this card on Magic Arena, and it's seen quite a bit of play. It's shown up in some like weird janky Storm style decks. It shows up in Yawgmoth, which is probably the scariest thing for Modern. Yawgmoth, already one of the best decks in the format. Now with Phyrexian Tower, it is very possible to play your Yawgmoth on turn 2. You just like turn 1 Mana Dork, turn 2 land drop, tap the Mana Dork, sack the Mana Dork, ramp up to 4 mana, play your Yawgmoth. So it speeds up Yawgmoth by at least an entire turn. And then it also sees playing some Goblins decks where you use this to ramp into Muxus. So I think this card will definitely see a lot of Modern play. In Legacy, it's used to sack Veteran Explorer to get a bunch of lands into play. So what do we do with this card in Modern? And maybe the scariest part of this card, outside of the fact that it easily slots into Yawgmoth, and that's already one of the best decks in the format, is this card just works really well with a lot of the best cards that are already in the format. Think of Orcish Bowmasters. It makes it a mass token, which is really good sacrifice fodder. So you can like sack your Bowmasters, ramp into Shieldred to turn early. It also is absurd with Grief, and this is the other really scary part of this card. We're talking about how Yawgmoth, already one of the best decks in the format. You know what else is one of the best decks in the format? Is Grief Scamming. And this card is insane with the Grief Scan plan. So think of this. It's turn 1. You evoke your Grief. You do your little scam thing where you're going to reanimate it once it dies. With the evoke trigger on the stack, you sack it to your Phyrexian Tower, giving you 2 mana, so then you can also play a Dothy Voidwalker, you can play an Orcish Bowmasters, and this is all happening on turn 1. On turn 1! So I think this will definitely show up in the Grief Scam style decks. The question is going to be, how many of these do you play? Because it is legendary, and it really depends on what you're trying to do with it. We've seen some timeless decks on Magic Arena, like Storm decks that really need the ritual effect this land offers, play the full 4 copies, and you're like, I'm gonna legend rule myself sometimes, but that's fine, kind of like Nykthos and Devotion. Other decks like Yawgmoth usually play like a miserly one of, where it's gonna be really good when you draw it, but you don't want to legend rule yourself a bunch. So I think this card will definitely see play in some number in a bunch of decks. It also might make new decks. It works really well with like Shambling Ghast, which likes dying to make a treasure token. Stitcher Supplier likes dying to fill your graveyard. So maybe we see some brand new sacrifice style decks develop purely because of Phyrexian Tower. The other thing we've seen with Phyrexian Tower on Arena is people play it with Necropotence as a way to ramp into Necro a turn earlier. And you're probably thinking, okay, that's cute, but I'm a Modern player. This doesn't matter to me because we don't have Necro in Modern. And that's true, but now we kind of do, because we're getting Necrodominance, a new callback to Necropotence. So Necrodominance, triple black mana, legendary enchantment. It says skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you can pay any amount of life. If you do draw that many cards, your max hand size is 5, and if a card or token would be put in your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So Necrodominance calls back to Necropones, kind of does a very similar thing as this triple black enchantment that can generate a huge amount of card advantage. There are some downsides here. The biggest downside is it reduces your hand size, right? Also, the timing of the draw is kind of awkward. Like, you go to your end step, you can pay 10 life to draw 10 cards, but then you need to discard almost immediately down to 5 cards in hand, unless you have a way to like combo off and use those cards to instant speed on your end step. So this is a card that I think, wow, it's really hard to evaluate this card. Infamously, Necropones itself was rated 1 star when it was spoiled back 30 years ago, and then it went on to like literally break magic after it was printed. Necrodominance, I don't want to underrate this card. I think this card is either going to be downright broken, like scary, one of the best cards in Modern, or it's going to be stone unplayable. I don't think there's really any middle ground here. So what's the upside case of this card? What's the this is downright broken, one of the best cards in Modern case? Well, there's a few different ways you can use this. So one is, this is a way you can lose as much life as you want on your end step. So if you're Death Shadowing or doing janky life swap things, this is a 3-mana enchantment that basically says, set your life total to 1 if that's what you want to do with it. Plus you can control it. You go to 3 if you want, or 5 if you want. So some decks, that's going to be pretty valuable. It also seems really sweet in decks that can just dump their hand really quickly. Maybe you're playing some sort of aggro deck with a bunch of 1-drops. Maybe you're grief scamming. Grief scam decks tend to spend a ton of cards putting their evoke elementals into play. So if you're a deck that can dump your hand or get hellbent, then Necrodominance on your end step is just like pay 5 life, draw 5 cards. Next turn I got 5 new cards to work with. Then hopefully you play all those cards, and then on your end step you draw 3, 4, 5 cards, do it again. So that seems really powerful. It's just a way to refuel in a deck that's going to empty its hand quickly. It's also kind of insane with Shieldred, and Shieldred really good in Modern. So if you get down Shieldred, you can Necrodominance, pay as much life as you want, but you're actually going to end up gaining a life because Shieldred's going to gain you 2 life for every 1 life you spend to draw a card with Necrodominance, which is actually different than original Necro, because original Necro doesn't actually draw you cards, it like exiles them and puts them in your hand. So comboing with Shieldred seems really good. Plus, if you want to go really deep, there are ways around the restrictions on Necrodominance. One is Born Upon the Winds. This just lets you cast all your spells with flash. So maybe there's like some weird Storm deck where you go to your end step, you pay all your life to Necro to draw like 19 cards, and then you Born Upon the Winds and try to just storm off at instant speed on your end step, which would be hilarious. It also works with Reliquary Tower, because remember, the big drawback on this card is your max hand size is 5, but if you have a Reliquary Tower, you can get around this, and this comes down to timestamp. So the way this works is, if you play Necrodominance and then you play Reliquary Tower, you will have no max hand size, and you can go to your end step, draw as many cards as you want, keep them all in your hand. On the other hand, if you play Reliquary Tower first and then Necrodominance, then your max hand size will be limited to 5. So keep that in mind. It basically just depends on the order that you play the cards. You want to play Reliquary Tower after Necrodominance if you want its no max hand size to apply. So those are the things you can do with this card. Now let's talk about the unplayable case for this card. So number one is the One Ring exists. And is this as good as the One Ring? It's 3 black mana rather than colorless. It doesn't give you protection. It only draws on your end step. It reduces your max hand size. So that's question number 1. Like, is Necrodominance just a worse One Ring, even though it offers like this huge burst card advantage potential and can potentially draw you more cards right away than the One Ring? But I think in a lot of decks, the One Ring might just be better because One Ring's kind of busted and it's even indestructible. The other issue with this card is it's drawing a ton of cards actually good in Modern right now because Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred are such heavily played cards. Think about the absolute nightmare of this card is you play your Necrodominance, you don't get a draw step anymore, so you don't get your 1 card per turn, and then as you go to your end step, your opponent flashes in the Bowmasters. What do? Do you spend all your life to draw cards and trigger Bowmasters a bunch of times? Do you just be like, I'm not going to draw cards for the rest of the game? You're not going to win that way. Also, as good as Necrodominance is with your Shieldred, it's pretty bad if your opponent has a Shieldred. So I think this card, I like it. And I'm going to say I think this card is going to be busted, but only in specific decks. I don't think you're just going to jam this in every deck, but in certain decks, I think it's going to be really good. The other place this is going to be really interesting is in some commander decks, especially commanders that just care about drawing cards, like Queza, Sheoldred. In these decks, it's way better than Necro, because Necro doesn't actually draw you cards. Like I said before, exiles them, and then you get them on your end step. But with Necrodominance and like Queza, you can just pay a ton of life, draw a ton of cards, drain your opponents a bunch, gain the life back, or Sheoldred, you actually end up gaining life if you activate Necrodominance. So Necrodominance, really interesting callback to one of the most broken cards in the history of Magic. I think the card is going to be really strong. Like I said before, you can't play it in every deck. It's not going to work in every deck, and I am worried about the Orcish Bowmasters meta. It seems like Wizards really designed this set with Orcish Bowmasters in mind. It's got a bunch of creatures that don't die to it. It's got cards like this that would probably be super busted if Orcish Bowmasters didn't exist. So that is the downside case, but I do think there's going to be decks that can take advantage of this, and once it hits the battlefield, it's going to be like a combo piece where you're expecting I just might die at any time. Next up, we have a new 2-mana mana dork in Fanatic of Rhonas. So 2 mana for a 1/4 Snake Druid. It taps to make green or ferocious. If you have a creature power 4 or greater, it taps to add 4 green mana, and then it has Eternalize of 4. So from the graveyard, you can exile it, get a 4/4 zombie Snake Druid version of it, which of course, since it's a 4/4, means it'll tap for 4 for sure. So Fanatic of Rhonas is really interesting. On one hand, traditionally in Modern, mana dorks need to be 1 mana to be good. You don't see really many or any 2-mana mana dorks see play in the format, but cards like Llanowar Elves, Noble Hierarch, Birds of Paradise, Arbor Elf, they all died to Orcish Bowmasters, so you don't see a lot of play anymore, and all of those mana dorks are making a mana. Maybe you can argue that Arbor Elf can make 2 mana in some cases with Utopia Sprawl, but really they're making 1 mana. The upside of Fanatic of Rhonas is if you can build around this, where it's making 4 mana regularly early in the game, it's kind of ridiculous. Plus remember, this is a 1/4, which means it's a mana dork that plays really good defense. It survives Bowmasters, it blocks Ragavan, it blocks Thalia, it blocks pretty much all the early game creatures, and it survives Lightning Bolt. So even though when I hear 2-mana mana dork, I don't automatically think, okay, that card's going to be really good in Modern. In this case, there might be enough upside with making 4 mana and having just this ridiculously big butt for a mana dork that might actually make this card playable. So as far as turning on this card, and remember, if this is making 1 mana, downright bad. You're not going to play this as a 2-mana 1/4 that makes a single mana. That's not a Modern playable card. You really need to build your deck so it's making 4 mana, hopefully on turn 3. So how do you do this? So if you look at just commonly played cards in Modern, Bonecrusher Giant does it, Territorial Kavu does it, Cyanide Rocco does it. Of course, some of those are domain cards. I don't know how you fit this in domain or kind of make the mana work in that one, but there are ways to do it. And once you get it down, if you can turn this on, this is just a great way to ramp into whatever big finisher you have, a Primeval Titan, a Karn Liberated, because 4 mana is an absurd amount of mana. I really want to bring back the Gruul Blood Moon Ponza deck. This used to be one of my favorite Modern decks, where you'd use Arbor Elf and Utopia Sprawl to ramp into Blood Moons and Bone Crushers and Inferno Titans, but this deck just kind of faded away. Once Bowmasters came around to snipe the Arbor Elf, maybe Fanatic of Rhonas can be the replacement for Arbor Elf. It's going to be a little bit slower. It's not going to let us turn to a Blood Moon, which is awkward, but still, if we want to be ramping into like Inferno Titans or whatever, this is going to get the job done really, really well. There's also some other possibilities here. So this works really well with Wayward Swordtooth, Topiary Stomper, these 3-drop ramp creatures, because they're big enough to turn on Fanatic of Rhonas right away. So I'm imagining some like mono green devotion deck where you're like, turn 2 Fanatic of Rhonas, turn 3, I play my Topiary Stomper, get a land, and then I tap my Fanatic of Rhonas for 4 mana, because now I have Ferocious, and then I play like Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, and then I can untap Fanatic of Rhonas, make 4 more mana, and play, I don't know, a Cavalier of Thorns or something. There are some incredibly explosive lines that this card offers, kind of like how we see Kiora untapping Nykthos. Not quite as busted in the late game, but still, if you can be untapping this in some way, it is absolutely wild. So I think it has potential there as well. There's even infinite combo potential with this card, and they're actually pretty easy infinite combos, so you do have to turn on Ferocious. So you need a 4-power creature, but once you have Ferocious on, Umbra Mantle or Sword of the Perrunes just makes infinite mana. You can tap for 4, untap for less than 4, do it again, do it again, do it again, make infinite green mana, use it to win the game. And I think this card probably sees a lot of commander play. I'm always surprised when you look at the most played commander cards, how high Bloom Tender is on the list. Is this mana dork that can potentially tap for up to 5 mana if you're in a 5-color deck? I think Fanatic of Rhonas is just like better in general. Like, it's got a better body. Ferocious, I think, is easier to turn on early than having 5 different colors of permanents on the battlefield. So I think this will see a lot of play. I don't play a ton of mana dorks in Commander because I get Wrathed away, but the fact that this makes 4 mana if you build around it, and if it does get Wrathed away, you can always eternalize it and try again in a couple more turns, I think makes this a staple in any green creature style deck. Think of like Chulane or Goreclaw or Omnath, anything that's like, all right, I'm playing big creatures, I'm playing lots of creatures, I'm ramping into big creatures. I think that Fanatic of Rhonas is going to be an absolute all-star there. So Fanatic of Rhonas, kind of weird to be hyped for a 2-mana mana dork, but this is maybe the best 2-mana mana dork that we have ever seen. So I think the card has some modern potential thanks to its 1/4 stats and just the ridiculous amount of mana it can make, and an easy commander staple. We also got a funny one. I don't know how good this card's gonna be, but it's Crabomination. Crabomination. Very good, Wizards. It is a 6-mana 5/5. It's a black card. It's a crab demon. It has a merge from artifact 7. So you can sack an artifact and reduce its cost by the artifact's mana value. So in theory, if you sack a 5+ mana value artifact, it's going to be double black mana. And then it says when it enters the battlefield, target opponent exiles the top card of their library, a card at random from their graveyard, and a card at random from their hand, and you may cast a spell from among the cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. So obviously, the effect is really powerful, right? Assuming that you can emerge it out and get it for 2 mana. If you're casting this for like 6 mana, it's just probably going to be too slow for Modern most of the time. Also worth noting, it's an ETB trigger, so you can't blink it or reanimate it or wherever that's going to work. But what do you actually do with this card? So it reminds me of Distended Mindbender, but like way better. Distended Mindbender was a big emerge threat, except it only made your opponent discard 1 or 2 cards from their hand. Crabomination, way better than that, making the discard random, and most importantly, letting you cast one of the cards for free, means this can't just straight up win you the game. If you had an Archon of Cruelty, a Primeval Titan, an Emrakul, you probably just straight up win the game with Crabomination. So I think the easiest way to actually emerge this into play is going to be some weird affinity shell where like you have Mirror Enforcer or Sojourner's Companion, Frog Mirror Enforcer or Thought Monitor, and then you just emerge this and hopefully hit something big to win. It is in awkward colors, but remember, we just got Imscure as well, which also kind of cares about the same things. So maybe we see some sort of like Rakdos affinity deck. Worst case, the affinity deck can easily be 5 colors if it wants to. It used to be 5 colors because you have a bunch of 5-color artifact lands that'll allow it to play whatever it wants to. So will this make it in like Synthesizer affinity? Probably not, but could we see a new build of affinity emerge that's playing Imscure and playing Crabomination? That does seem like a possibility. It also works with mana rocks. This might be more of a commander thing because mana rocks don't really see that much play in Modern, but if you play a Chromatic Lantern, Coalition Relic on turn 3, the next turn you can tap it for mana and then emerge off of it and get down your Crabomination and hope for the best. Also could be good in a Metalwork Colossus shell. Metalwork Colossus wants a lot of artifacts, plus you can always get it back from your graveyard if you want to. You can sack it, play your Crabomination for 2 mana. So this card, I think, is very intriguing. Is a reanimation target. I don't think it's Archon of Cruelty good, because remember, there's a lot of randomness here. Like, yes, you're going to get 3 cards from your opponent, but they're all going to be random cards. So there is a chance that you go like land, which would be pretty sad. If this is just hitting a bunch of lands, you're going to be very disappointed. But the ceiling is also ridiculously high, where if you hit your opponent's Archon of Cruelty or your Emrakul, or even just like Tarmogoyfs and Lilianas and Ren and 6s, you're going to be pretty happy getting this big body that comes along with something else for free. So Crabomination seems like a really fun build around. I don't know if this card's going to be like busted. It does take a lot of setup to really get it to work, especially considering you really want to be emerging it for it to work. So you need these big artifacts on the battlefield, but when it works, it's going to be really funny, and the ceiling is pretty much win the game on the spot. We also got one of the most broken cards oh my god, Wizards, I don't know what you're thinking. In Nadu Winged Wisdom, and this card is absolutely wild. So a 3-mana 3/4 flying, it's a legendary bird wizard. It says creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it on the battlefield, otherwise put it in your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn. So it is very important to point out with this wording. First, twice each turn, kind of the Modern Horizons 3 power creep to once each turn that we've seen a lot lately, but it's important to really point out what this ability does. So Nadu gives all of your creatures this ability. So what it actually means is whenever a creature is targeted, you get to do the card draw thing, but each creature can trigger it twice each turn. So if you have 5 creatures, you could potentially trigger this 10 times each turn. So it's not twice each turn, period, for all your creatures. It's twice each turn for each creature. The other huge thing about this wording is it doesn't say your opponent controls, and it says ability along with spells, which means as you target your own things, you can draw a ton of cards. So this is essentially kind of like a Leovold, but way better because it works with your own things, mixed with Coiling Oracle style draw. So what do you do with this? So first off, you can just like play this, get some creatures, and cast Blossoming Defenses and Mutagenic Growths and draw a bunch of cards and ramp a bunch. But it gets even better than that. The real trick of this card is equipment, especially equipment that have free equip costs like Lightning Greaves. So if you have a Lightning Greaves out and you go to put on a creature, you are technically targeting that creature with an ability, which will trigger Nadu. So let's say you have 5 creatures on the battlefield. You just Lightning Greaves, free equip on a creature, draw a card. If it's a land, you put it into play. Then you move it to the next creature, draw a card, put it into play. Then you move it to the next creature. You're just going to draw so many cards for free. It's like an absurd amount of value. If you want to go even deeper, add something like Scoot Swarm to the mix, because remember, if you hit a land with Nadu, you get to put it into play. So if one of your creatures is Scoot Swarm, you're going to hit some number of lands off the top of your deck as you're drawing all these cards with Nadu, and every time you hit a land, you're going to make an insect token, and then once you do that, you'll be able to use that insect to draw more cards by putting the Lightning Greaves on it, and then eventually you make more Scoot Swarms, and you probably just draw your entire deck and make this huge board of Scoot Swarms and win the game. Also worth mentioning, along with Lightning Greaves, it works with this weird equipment called Shuku, which is essentially a useless equipment. 1 to cast, gives equipped creature +1/+0, but it's free to equip. So I think that's the easiest use of this card, is just moving these free equipment around to generate a huge amount of ramp and card advantage. Also, there's a deck in Legacy that kind of uses this plan called Cephalid Breakfast. It combos off using Cephalid Illusionist, which when it becomes a target of a spell or ability, you mill 3 cards. So you mill your entire deck and then win with Thassa's Oracle or whatever. We can kind of do this now with Nadu, right? The same combo we were talking about. We just keep targeting it. We got Stoneforge to find the Shuku or find the Lightning Greaves, keep moving it around, draw through our entire deck, win with the Thassa's Oracle. So I think this card is going to be really strong in Modern. Plus, we're focused on all these combo plans. Remember too, it also just gives all your creatures, if your opponent tries to kill it with a Lightning Bolt or a Fatal Push, you get to draw a card. So you're going to get value as your opponent targets your stuff as well. So maybe there's combos with like Venerated Rot Priest and Ivy and slinging spells. This card is just absolutely wild. So I think Nadu, this card's just ridiculous. One of the most powerful cards in the entire set. This card, I think, has a look of a card that might be like downright broken or a really strong combo piece, and you can play it fairly. It's a 3-mana 3/4 flyer. So I think this card is just really strong. It should see Modern play, and I think it'll see a ton of Commander play. Outside of like being your commander or combo potential, I would run this just for value in a lot of decks to draw some cards and do some ramping. It is that strong. We also got a new Devoid removal spell in Abstruse Appropriation, and I love this card. So 4 mana, it's Orzhov, but technically it's colorless. It says exile target non-land permanent, and you may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you can spend colorless mana as though it was mana of any color to cast the spell. So Abstruse Appropriation, it's kind of like Hurl Through Hell, this commander card that has never been legal in 60 card formats, but it hits any non-land permanent, mixed with Utter End. Utter End is a card that I played a lot in Commander, just 4 mana instant speed, exile non-land permanent. Abstruse Appropriation basically is Utter End, except you can probably cast the card. You do need either colorless mana or the right colors of mana, but still, like, that seems very attainable. A 4-mana instant speed removal spell that also lets you cast the spell is kinda wild. I did want to mention, in Modern, and I think this is really mostly designed to be a commander card, like, 4 mana is a lot for removal in a format like Modern. I did want to point out that it doesn't work with Grief and Solitude. Even though it's got those white and black mana symbols, because of Devoid, it's technically colorless, so it doesn't pitch to these cards. Otherwise, it would be even more exciting, but it is pretty sweet that you can, like, snipe a Teferi and then cast the Teferi, or snipe your opponent's Shieldred and cast the Shieldred. So I think all around, to me, this looks like a staple commander removal spell that I will play in pretty much every Orzhov deck. But in Modern, even though it's really spicy, and maybe it shows up as like a one-of, I'm a little worried that 4 mana is just a little bit expensive for removal. We also got a new attempt at fixing Birthing Pod in Birthing Ritual. So Birthing Ritual, 2-mana enchantment, and it has a wall of text. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature, look at the top 7 cards of your library. Then you may sack a creature. If you do, you may put a creature card with mana value X or less from among those cards onto the battlefield, where X is 1 plus the sacrifice creature's mana value, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So if you think about what this is, it's a callback to Birthing Pod, obviously, but it's really like essentially Neo form. Triggers on your end step. You only get to go 7 cards deep, so you don't necessarily get what you want, but it is cute that you get to peek first and make sure you're not going to whiff before you choose to sacrifice something. And I gotta say, overall, I think this card is downright bad. My expectation for this card is that it is stone unplayable. So here's my problems with this card. So first, if you compare it to like Neoform or Eldritch Evolution, where you get this one-shot burst to do something big, you can like do some of the tricks we've seen with like sack an Allosaurus Rider, get a Grizzlebrand, but if you're gonna do that, why not just Neoform or Eldritch Evolution and get it right away during your main phase where you can use it at a functional time? So I think it's like bad Neoform or bad Eldritch Evolution in that scenario. And then if you compare it to Birthing Pod, a big part of Birthing Pod's power was its ability to chain creatures. We're able to like Birthing Pod into a Deceiver Exarch to untap the Birthing Pod, and then sack something, get a Restoration Angel to blink the Deceiver Exarch to untap the Birthing Pod, and then get a Zealous Conscript to untap the Birthing Pod, and eventually this ends with you like chaining into a Kiki-Jiki, comboing off and winning the game. Birthing Ritual is not going to do that, right? It's one shot on your end step, and it might not even get what you want. You're only going 7 cards deep, so your odds of hitting the creature that you want aren't horrible, but they're also not great. So when you add all this together, I just don't really see the uses for this card. At first I was like, okay, I play this in Yawgmoth, right? So I can sack my dorks and get Yawgmoth. But if I'm doing that, wouldn't I rather just Eldritch Evolution and get Yawgmoth right away? Plus Eldritch Evolution is mana value +2 rather than +1. So I'm really not sure where this card could see play. Let me know in the comments, because I love Birthing Pod and I think this is a really cool callback. But when I actually read through the card and think about what it does, outside of like, I'm gonna play it in like a fun value-y creature heavy commander deck just to like, you know, see what happens, I'm really not seeing how this card can do what Birthing Pod used to do, or it can be better than Eldritch Evolution in Neo form at doing what those cards do. So if I'm missing something, let me know. But my guess is Birthing Ritual, cool callback, cool flavor, huge weird wall of text, awesome Drew Tucker art, but not a very playable card. We also got Aether Revolt, and Aether Revolt is kind of intriguing. So it's a 4-mana enchantment. It has Revolt, well done Wizards, where as long as a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2, and then it says, when you get 1 or more energy, Aether Revolt deals that much damage to any target. So first off, in Modern in specific, and also in Commander, Revolt's not a big deal, right? You crack a fetch land, that's going to be enough to trigger Revolt. So I'm not too intimidated by needing to trigger Revolt with this card. And then your reward is kind of getting a Torbrand enchantment. It only works with non-combat damage, which is a little twist on Torbrand, but essentially any damage that you deal, you get +2 as long as it's non-combat damage. The real exciting part about this card, and I will say right now, I don't expect this to be like top tier competitive or anything, but it is a deck that I want to build, is what it does with energy. I think that is the most interesting part of this card. So if you think about how this works, let's assume we crack a fetch land to trigger Revolt. So any of our non-combat combat damage, gets +2 damage. Let's say we do that, and then let's say we cast Galvanic Discharge, which is 1 mana, choose target creature or planeswalker. You get 3 energy, then you pay any amount of energy, it deals that much damage to the permanent, but you pay Galvanic Discharge for 1 mana, you're going to get 3 energy. That's going to be 3 damage with Aether Revolt to any target, but remember it's +2 damage, so for 1 mana, you actually get 5 damage. Or you play Attune the Narrative, which gives you 2 energy, it's going to end up being 4 damage, or maybe you loop Greenbelt Rampagers a little bit, you're going to deal so much damage. So in a deck filled with energy cards, I think it's pretty realistic that you Aether Revolt in the next turn, you make enough energy that you just kill your opponent on the spot, assuming you turn on Revolt. So like I said, I'm not expecting, especially with Boseiju and Pick Your Poison or whatever, that this is going to be like a legit top tier plan in Modern, but it seems like a really fun janky build around. Also kind of ridiculous with Dynavolt Tower, you can try to storm off Dynavolt Tower. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you get 2 energy. So if you got Aether Revolt out, you're going to deal 2 damage, but it's +2 if you have Revolt. So every instant or sorcery is going to be 4 damage to any target. So that's only 5 spells you would need to cast to win the game and just 20 your opponent on the spot. The place this will see play for sure, outside of our super sweet against the odds deck, I think is energy commander decks. If you're playing a commander deck that's about producing energy, has an energy commander, I don't know why you wouldn't play this card. It just seems like a great alt win condition where as you're doing what your deck wants to do anyway, which is making energy, you just kind of accidentally kill your opponent or shoot down all their stuff with Aether Revolt. So Aether Revolt, it's definitely our like janky red enchantment from the set and our traditional callback to a set name. What do we have? We got what? Mirrodin Besieged in original Modern Horizons. Then we got Urza's Saga in Modern Horizons 2. Now we get Aether Revolt in Modern Horizons 3. So good job on that one, Wizards. So I like the card a lot. I don't expect it to be truly competitive, but it does seem incredibly fun to build around, and it is a really powerful payoff for an energy deck. We also got another good reprint in Recruiter of the Guard. So Recruiter of the Guard, 3 mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a creature with toughness 2 or less, reveal it and put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So Recruiter of the Guard, kind of a legacy staple. If you think about what this does in Legacy, it mostly shows up in Aether Vial decks, Death and Taxes style decks, where you're playing all these cheap kind of hate creatures, Bowmasters and Skyclave Apparitions and Solitudes and Stoneforges and Thalias, and Recruiter of the Guard just gets whatever creature you need for that given situation. And I think that's going to be the same role that this serves in Modern. It also shows up in Alluring combo to get your combo pieces, and yesterday we were talking about how Primal Prayers kind of brings Alluring combo to Modern, so I think it could show up in that deck as well. But I imagine this is going to be like a humans card. It is a human, so you get your Champion of the Parish or whatever other, your Thalia's Lieutenant, whatever you need for the matchup. Really good in Death and Taxes. Maybe Death and Taxes can make a comeback where this is getting Leonin Arbiter, it's getting White Orchid Phantom, it's getting Giver of Runes. It also works pretty well with blink effects. You can reset it with Ephemerate to do even more tutoring. So I think Recruiter of the Guard, solid reprint. It's got some value to it. It sees legacy play. Sure, it dies to Bowmasters, but it does its job along the way of tutoring up something else, whatever you need for the situation. So I'm definitely excited to see if this can bring something like Death and Taxes back in Modern, thanks to the new support we're getting. In the realm of lower rarity cards, couple I wanted to shout out. First up, Charitable Levy. So Charitable Levy, 2 mana enchantment. It says non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast, and then whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, put a collection counter on it. Then if there are 3 or more collection counters on it, sack it. If you do, draw a card, and then you can search your library for a Plains card, not even basic, so you can get a Surveil Land or a Triome or whatever, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So Charitable Levy, it's kind of like a temporary Thalia on an enchantment that eventually sort of solemn simulacrums you, giving you a card and also putting a land into play. And this is a card that I think is mostly interesting for Commander. In Commander, it's a white ramp spell that isn't catch-up ramp. It's one of the only white ramp spells that doesn't require you to be behind on lands for it to work. The downside of the card is it can be kind of slow, right? Like, if you draw this later in the game, it might take a while for your opponents to cast 3 non-creature spells. I guess you can try to cast non-creatures into it and pay the tax to ramp that way. So it's going to be interesting to see how good this card is in Commander. My gut reaction is it's probably going to be worth playing as a white ramp card, especially since you get to draw a card off of it too. You like annoy your opponents for a couple turns and then eventually ramp out of it. My guess is it's going to be good. I don't think it's like busted because of the timing issues where it is kind of rough off the top in the late game, but if you draw it early, it's a really solid ramp spell. People cast their mana rocks, it's going to turn on and get the counters, and then you ramp with it. So I think it's going to be good enough, but I'm actually curious. How do you think this compares to like Knight of the White Orchid or something like that? The kind of traditional catch-up ramp. This used so much playing Commander. Definitely an interesting twist on it, but I think it probably is going to be pretty good. We also got a new to Modern reprint in Buried Alive. So Buried Alive, 3 mana sorcery, search your library for 3 creature cards, put them into your graveyard, then shuffle. So this is just a great way to set up your reanimation. If you're trying to Goryo's Vengeance or Persist, whatever, this just gets the 3 creatures you want in your graveyard the most into your graveyard really efficiently early in the game. It also has some like weird combo potential. We were talking about like Warren Soul Trader combo that needs Gravecrawler. This is the way you can like tutor your Gravecrawler into the graveyard, or maybe you have Unearth in hand. You can tutor your Warren Soul Trader into the graveyard and then reanimate it and then start the combo and win the game. So any sort of like graveyard reanimation style combo deck, I think Buried Alive is at least worth considering in Modern, especially since we don't have Entomb, right? We're lacking actual Entomb, the scariest way to put something in your graveyard. But this might be the next best option for Modern. Could even show up in some sort of living end deck. I don't think it shows up in like the most traditional builds probably, because you'd rather just cycle your cards, but you certainly could build a living end deck that rather than trying to put a bunch of janky cyclers into your graveyard, you just Buried Alive to put, I don't know, Grizzlebrands and Ionas and the biggest, scariest things in the graveyard, and then living end to get them all back and make it so your opponent can't win the game. So Buried Alive, I'm intrigued by this card. I think it could serve a purpose in Modern as like our bad, janky, modern version of Entomb, but I think it's close enough that in those graveyard decks, in those combo decks, I wouldn't be surprised to see people playing Buried Alive. Finally today, a bunch of lower rarity cards, some pretty interesting stuff for limited, maybe some fringe constructed stuff or commander stuff, but like usual, you can check them all out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Modern Horizons 3 spoilers for today. So let me know what you think about all these sweet new cards. How busted is Phyrexian Tower? What's your favorite card of the day? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow for even more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against Odds, where we found out just how much life we could gain by making a ton of ancient cornucopias.